Welcome to the Chinese Canadian Museum's podcast, The School Room. I'm your host, Melissa Lee, CEO of the museum. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to explore some of the community connections in Vancouver, Chinatown. And so we're so excited to have Marjorie Young with us. She is a retired speech therapist turned visual artist who's been an active part of Vancouver Chinatown for over 70 years. Welcome, Marjorie, to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's so great to learn a little bit more about your life. I thought maybe we could begin by talking a bit about your family history. I understand your family has deep ties to the Chinatown community. Your grandfather had a produce farm in Steveston that supplied many of the Chinese restaurants, and your father was the manager at WK Gardens, their restaurant to host community banquets. Can you tell us a little bit more about life with your father and your grandfather so enmeshed in the Chinatown community?
Grandpa had a farm in Steveston, and he used to truck vegetables into town, and he supplied most of the restaurants in town. And then when my dad was old enough to help out, then my dad took over the trucking part of the business. And that's how he met Wilbur and Harold Lim at the WK restaurant, because he would deliver vegetables there. And then eventually, Uncle Harold introduced his sister, my mom, to my dad, and that's how they met.
Can you tell us a little bit more about WK Gardens? I understand it was really a place, a restaurant where many famous and wealthy people frequented during the 1920s and 60s in Chinatown.
My Aunt Grace was married to Harold, and she was Miss Chinatown of 1937. And we have a photo of her with Shirley Temple. So movie stars used to come like Gary Cooper, Bing Crosby, Bob Hope. And Uncle Harold had pictures with these celebrities. And Pierre Trudeau, when he was dating Margaret, would come down to WK and they would have dinner there. And there was a huge banquet for Lester B. Pearson when he was prime minister. So, yeah, it was like the place to be in Chinatown.
Why was that? Like, why? I guess, can you tell us a little bit more about what it was like the decor? What was the food everyone ordered, or what was something that you always remembered eating when you were there?
They had a live band, which, a lot of the restaurants in China didn't have. So they had a 5-piece band on the weekends, and people would go dining and dancing with the big night out. They had a dance floor, ballroom, and it seated 300. And then there was an upstairs that would seat another 300. So total banquet capacity was 600 people.
And what do you remember eating when you were there? Like, were there special dishes that WK Gardens was known for?
Yeah, well, the chef, because he knew who we were, like we were family, right? He would make a special chow mein just for the kids. And it was just the kids' version of chow mein. It was our special version.
So, kids' version of chow mein, would that mean no vegetables?
Yeah, except for bean sprouts.
I have kids, so that's why I ask if it's like a no vegetable chow
Yeah,
mein.
yeah, it was.
So, your father, Norman, was also impacted by the Chinese Exclusion Act, also known as the Chinese Immigration Act, and had to pay the head tax. Did he talk much about his experiences coming to Canada?
Well, not really. I got a lot of his documents when he passed away from the lawyer. So I was able to kind of piece together the things that he had to go through in order to find employment, for instance. Like, because he wasn't a citizen, he had to register then with the Republic of China. That's why we saw this Chinese passport, because he needed ID in order to apply for a job.
In your family, was there a lot of discussion or was there any discussion about what it was like to grow up under the Chinese Exclusion Act?
Not a lot of discussion. Their attitude was pretty stoic, like, well, that's the way it is. And then they just dealt with it. They just did what they could in order to survive.
And in your community, because I understand you grew up in Strathcona, was it mainly a Chinese Canadian community, like going to school in the neighborhood?
No, no. Because after the war, a lot of people came in from Eastern Europe. And so Strathcona at that time, in the 50s, after World War II, there were 52 different heritage languages spoken at Strathcona.
Wow.
Yeah. And the only kids that were born in Canada were the Chinese and the Japanese kids and the indigenous kids, of course. But all the others, like they came from Italy and Germany and Sweden and Norway, Ukraine, Russia, Portugal, Spain, you name it. They came from Europe. So we grew up in this multilingual, multicultural environment in Strathcona. And all our teachers were recent immigrants from the UK. So they taught us with Irish and Scottish and English accents. And they ran it like a British public school. Like we had houses. It- You belonged to a house, like Harry Potter time. you know. So there was the roses, the thistles, the shamrocks, and the maples. And then you had your colors, your house colors were red, blue, green, and yellow.
So what house did you belong to?
The roses.
That's a nice one.
Yeah.
And so how many kids were there in Strathcona at the time? It sounds like it was a real mix.
It was a real mix. Well, our classes were, I guess, normal size, like 25 kids or 30. All of us had English as second language because I didn't speak English until I started grade 1 because our grandparents took care of us when we were growing up, and they didn't speak English.
And do you still keep in touch, or did you still keep in touch after you graduated from Strathcona with your classmates?
Oh yeah, a group of us went to Britannia together, and then we went to university together.
What are these reunions like?
I mean, it's just like friends getting together. Because we grew up in Chinatown, our parents knew each other. So my brothers knew everybody else's siblings. So we just knew each other, brothers and sisters and cousins, and our parents knew each other.
Did most people stay in Vancouver after graduating, or did they move all around the world?
Well, they were able to move around, but before, because of restrictions, segregation. Really, it was segregation because Chinese weren't allowed to buy property or rent property outside of Chinatown. There was nowhere else for us to go except in this particular location. But afterwards, with the changes in society and the laws changed because it was legislative racism up to that point. until we were able to buy property outside of Chinatown.
So after school, you ended up having a career as a speech pathologist. Can you tell us more about why you decided to take on that career?
Well, I got my bachelor's in linguistics, and I thought, well, the idea of applied linguistics really interested me. So I was accepted in the first class that UBC had for speech language pathologists.
So that was the first class ever on speech pathology.
Yeah, there were only four of us. We were handpicked for this class.
So what was there like an interest at that time in the growing field of speech pathology, or what do you think spurred the university to create that?
It was also the interest in things like augmentative communication, for instance, synthetic speech, and the fact that this was an occupation that was needed because there were more people showing up with, say, head injuries or strokes or neurological issues. People were living because of better medicine, right? Before they would just die. You couldn't save them, right? But because of improved medical care, these people were living through strokes and brain injuries, but with impairments in their speech.
Was that your specialty? People that had been in accidents
Yes.
or Mhm.
Yeah. So I did at GF Strong, that's what I worked with mainly head injuries and stroke. And then I started my own practice and focused on brain injuries and autism clients. And most of the referrals were either, well, for autism, the referrals came from the Ministry of Children and Families. And for the brain injury clients, they came mainly through personal injury lawyers. So I had to do the medical legal assessments on cases, on clients.
Did you ever see any cases like, I'm just thinking of movies where this happens, where somebody wakes up with entirely different memories, like from 30 years ago where they weren't living, or they wake up speaking a different language? Is that completely made up from movies and TV, or are there actual cases of that that happen in your field?
Well, I don't know of any personally. I've heard anecdotal recountings, but I've never seen that myself.
I guess, like, there's a lot of mysteries in how the brain accumulates language and learns. Would you say that's the case?
Well, usually the first language comes back. Like if somebody's bilingual or trilingual, the first language comes back.
Interesting. I guess that could be the case then, right? Like, so for example, as you said, you grew up and your grandparents only spoke to you in, let's say, like, was it Cantonese? And then I mean, in a way, it's the same with my daughters. Like, they grew up in Hong Kong, but now they've moved to Canada and they don't retain any of that Cantonese. But it's still like with the brain, sometimes it can be embedded and come back. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. Like old memories seem to come back. I guess with recall, the long term memory comes back, whereas the short term, the recent memory tends to disappear.
Oh. And so the long term memory would be called recall.
Yeah, from your childhood or things that happened way back.
Wow, that's fascinating. And what are some forms of therapy that you would use in order to reteach or have this kind of teaching of speech pathology?
Well, we used a lot of audiovisual aids. So, depending on the issues, if somebody is, say, a visual learner, we'll use flashcards. And then, of course, now that we have iPads and the applications, it's a breeze. But before, we used to have to hand make these flashcards and draw whatever it is we needed or cut out pictures from magazines. But now with the apps, it's really easy to just pull up a picture or, to make a picture board for somebody.
And I understand you have, since retiring, have had a second career as a visual artist.
Yes.
Was there an interest in becoming a visual artist because you had to kind of draw all your own aids for your speech pathology career, or have you always wanted to also be an artist?
Well, I've always been an artist. Like when I was 5, my kindergarten teacher got me into a children's art program. And at the time, it was downtown. On Saturdays, I would go and have art lessons. So I learned, like all through school, I went to art classes. Like some kids had ballet or music or whatever, and I had art lessons. So I have this background in not just drawing and painting, but I learned printmaking, I learned photography, I learned film animation, jewelry design.
You teach art classes also for seniors at some of the community centers in Vancouver. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it's like to teach art to seniors?
It depends on the class. I always ask, have you done this before? Or how many years have you been doing this? And then I can just gear the teaching to the experience level of the class as a whole. With beginners, we start off with really basic things like the type of paper to use, the type of brushes, and then we work on things like technique.
I think what's great about this is that you're able to teach seniors and also to let people know that if you want to be an artist, it's not too late. Like you can do it at any time or any part in your life. Could you talk more about that?
It's like music, art and music. You're never too old to learn to do those activities. And it's a great way to keep your mind active.
Do you feel like the seniors that you're teaching, it in a way it allows them to find fulfillment, or maybe they've always wanted to be an artist, but they were never able to in their career and they can kind of do it now in this stage of life?
Well, a lot of them are, they do this as a hobby or for social reasons. Like the Kerrisdale ladies, for instance, they're friends now. They form friendships. And so they get together. And of course, it becomes a social gathering. They chit chat and they paint, they dabble, and they do different things. But, it's a social thing for them. And I think that's equally important.
Absolutely. And do you find your own artistic practice has changed now from before when you were working?
Yeah, I have more time to devote for one thing, instead of rushing around, and I can pick specific projects to be involved in. Like I just finished a series for the next edition of the Multi-Faith calendar, and the theme is change and evolution. My topic is the salmon return to the lower mainland. So I've done a series on salmon and how the stream keepers have mitigated some of the urban growth and environmental pollution and so on to enable salmon to return to the traditional streams to spawn.
That's so nice. And do you mainly work in watercolor?
Watercolors, yes, and acrylics.
And I realized you were the featured artist for the BC Brain and Wellness Center,
Mhm.
which is great. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and your relationship with them?
The BC Brain Wellness is a program that I got into just for exercise, but because they focus on holistic therapy. There's art therapy, there's music therapy, there's a book club for intellectual stimulation, and then there's yoga, there's a mindfulness program, there's a nutrition program, and there's exercise. So I do the functional strength and balance work because I had hip surgery and I needed to recover from that. Also, I just recently had triple bypass. And so I needed the physical programs to just recover physically. I got involved with the creativity program and submitted artwork for that. So I was one of the feature artists for November last year.
So what kind of artwork did you submit for that?
Oh, just my watercolor paintings, like my great nieces and nephews.
That's so nice. So it's just really interesting also and wonderful to think that wellness includes not only kind of physical wellness, but also mental wellness, creative wellness as well.
Yes, yes.
I guess looking back on everything that you've lived in Vancouver and Strathcona and Chinatown, what are some things that you remember most fondly?
Going to Chinatown with my grandfather, like mostly we went down that to get fish or chicken or eggs or something because we had our vegetable garden, so we didn't need to buy vegetables. But he would take me around and introduce me to his old buddies, and then he would do the shopping, whatever we had to get. And then we would go to BC Royal and he would have coffee and chat with his buddies, and I would have Ovaltine and their apple tarts.
Oh, the famous apple tarts.
Yeah, the famous apple tarts. Oh, that was my favorite.
They still have apple tarts in Chinatown, but not at BC Royal. I think they're at Newtown
Yeah,
Bakery.
Newtown. Yeah.
So, when's your next class reunion?
Well, if we make it up to 85, it'll be. Yeah, we'll see. Let's see what happens.
It must be so nice to still get together and then see really the wealth of everyone's lives with like their children and their grandchildren and all the things that they've done since then.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on our podcast, Marjorie. It was a pleasure to speak to you and hear more.
Thank you.
This podcast was recorded on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We invite you all to reflect on the territories that you're on and the host nations. To learn more about the Chinese Canadian Museum and book tickets, visit us at ChineseCanadianMuseum.ca and follow us on Instagram at CCMuseumBC for updates. The School Room is presented by the Chinese Canadian Museum, hosted by Dr. Melissa Karmen Lee, and produced by Rosalie Gonawan. Production is supported by Noah Taylor and the Walrus Lab. The theme music and original audio was created by Joshua Young, and graphic design is by Studio Pian Pian He and Max Harvey. Stay tuned for next month's episode of The School Room, available wherever you get your podcasts.